Have you ever felt like the loudest voices always win, while your quiet strength goes unnoticed? Like you see more than you say, but the world only listens to noise. There's a quiet kind of intelligence the world overlooks, one that doesn't argue, doesn't chase attention, yet always stays 10 steps ahead. You don't need to shout to win. Sometimes the sharpest minds speak last. Stay with me. Let's explore how to lead without noise and outsmart without ever being seen. 1. Write clearly, think sharply. Have you ever felt overwhelmed by your own thoughts, as if there's a crowd inside your head, each voice pulling you in a different direction, and no matter how hard you try, you can't seem to quiet the noise? You sit down to make a decision, to map a plan, to respond to something important, but instead of clarity, you're met with a fog. You second guess, you stall, you react, and deep down, a quiet question surfaces. Why can't I think straight? The Stoics would have offered a simple but powerful answer. You haven't trained your reason. You haven't practiced ordering your thoughts like a disciplined general arranges his troops. Writing for the Stoic wasn't about appearing clever or eloquent. It was about survival. Marcus Aurelius, Emperor of Rome and student of Stoic philosophy, didn't write meditations for the world. He wrote to himself in silence because he knew that clarity on the page leads to clarity in life. His journal was not vanity, it was a mirror, a sword, a shield. It was how he prepared for the war within. We forget that every action begins as a thought. Every mistake, every triumph, every moment of restraint or regret, it starts in the mind. And if the mind is cluttered, if we haven't trained it to focus, to question, to distinguish what matters from what doesn't, then we are at the mercy of confusion. We become reactive, impulsive, easily provoked. But if you can think clearly, if you can break down your thoughts, examine them, write them out with precision and honesty, then you start to reclaim power. Not over others, but over yourself. And that is the foundation of true freedom. There was once a young man named Lucius who came to the philosopher Epictetus in frustration. He said, "Master, I try to live by reason, but in the moment I forget what matters. I fall into anger. I say things I regret. I make plans and abandon them. Why am I so easily lost?" Epictetus, calm as ever, said, "Sit down, take a reed and some parchment. Write down the next thing that troubles your peace. Then question it. Then challenge it. Then let it go." Lucius returned the next day with 10 pages of unexamined fears and false beliefs. Epictetus smiled. "Good," he said. "Now you see the battlefield. Now you can begin to train." Writing in the Stoic sense is not for show. It is not performance. It is a cleansing ritual. It is how the warrior prepares, not to fight others, but to master himself. You write not to be read, but to be revealed. You write not to convince others, but to make sure you understand what you believe and why. You bring your assumptions to light. You put your fears under the blade. You take your scattered, undisciplined mind and you give it a spine, a form, a path. Seneca said, "If a man knows not to which port he sails, no wind is favorable." But how many of us are drifting, not because the sea is wild, but because we've never sat down to chart our course? How many people keep chasing goals they never defined, reacting to emotions they never examined, clinging to beliefs they never questioned, simply because they've never trained their mind to slow down, reflect, and choose? There's a reason the Stoics wrote. There's a reason their words endure. They weren't trying to impress. They were trying to survive with dignity. They were trying to live the right way, with intention, with virtue, with mastery over the only kingdom that truly matters, their own soul. You can begin this today. No matter who you are or what you've been through, the page is waiting. Take 10 minutes tonight. Sit in silence. Write down what you fear, what you want, what you cannot let go of. Then look at those words. Question them. Ask, is this within my control? Is this aligned with my values? Or is this just noise I've been carrying? You'll be surprised at what surfaces. You'll be humbled by how much chaos you've tolerated in silence. But you'll also feel something you haven't felt in a while. Direction. There's no magic here, no special technique, just repetition, just courage, just brutal, quiet honesty. You don't need to write like a poet. You don't need to sound wise. You just need to be willing to see clearly, because that's where transformation begins. In a world that rewards appearance over substance, noise over thought, and speed over depth, the simple act of writing becomes a radical choice, a return to self, a discipline of the mind. And yes, it's slow, it's hard. Some days you'll stare at the page and feel nothing but resistance. That's fine. The Stoic doesn't avoid resistance. He trains through it, because he knows what's on the other side: clarity, peace, power. Real power is not found in dominating others. It's found in being able to govern your own thinking. If you can write it, you can hold it still. If you can hold it still, you can judge it clearly. And if you can judge it clearly, you can act with precision. That is what makes you dangerous in the best way possible. Not loud, not reactive, but sharp, present, intentional. Someone who doesn't just think, but thinks well. And that, my friend, is rare. So if you want to begin mastering your life, don't start with others. Start with your mind. And if your mind feels like a storm, then pick up the pen. That's how the Stoic calms the sea. Not by shouting at the waves, but by building a vessel strong enough to ride through them. Because clarity isn't given. It's earned, word by word, thought by thought, day by day. And when you've done that, when you've trained your inner voice to think like a philosopher and write like a warrior, you don't just live a better life. You live a life you can actually understand. Now, once the page is clear and the storm has settled, there's a deeper challenge waiting, the moment when your words must become your presence. And that begins with your voice. 2. Speak less, mean more. Have you ever spoken and immediately wished you hadn't? Words that slipped out too fast, too sharp, too vague, or worse. Words that fell flat, unheard, like dust in the air. You meant well. You tried to explain. But somehow, what was clear in your head came out clumsy, defensive, or diluted. And afterward, as silence settles around you, the thought lingers. Why didn't they listen? In moments like that, it's tempting to blame others, their bias, their impatience, their lack of attention. But a Stoic turns inward. The Stoic asks, was I truly present in what I said? Did I speak with intention or just with noise? Did I speak from order or from impulse? Because speech, for the Stoic, is not performance. It's a discipline. It's not about sounding impressive. It's about speaking from a place of clarity, control, and alignment. Your voice, when shaped by reason, becomes an extension of your character. And nothing reveals your character faster than the words you choose, especially when the pressure is high. Marcus Aurelius said, "Waste no more time arguing what a good man should be. Be one." But how does a man or woman reveal their virtue in a room where no one sees their actions, only hears their words? Through the way they speak, with composure, clarity, and deliberate thought. When you've trained your mind to think clearly and your tongue to speak carefully, your words carry weight. Not because you raise your voice, but because you don't need to. You've become someone others listen to without knowing why. That is not a trick. It's not manipulation. It's presence. And presence is built through discipline. I once knew a man named Elias. He wasn't loud, wasn't flamboyant, and rarely interrupted anyone. But when he spoke, the entire table fell silent. Not because he demanded it, but because his voice came from a place of calm certainty. He had trained himself to pause before speaking, to remove exaggeration from his language, and to say only what was essential. There was no fluff in his sentences, no need to prove or impress. Even in disagreement, he never attacked, he clarified. And because of that, even those who opposed him respected him. He was, in the truest sense, untouchable, not because he fought, but because he understood. That's the kind of strength you cannot fake. You cannot borrow it with charm or amplify it through volume. It comes from within, from a practiced stillness, a sharpened clarity. Epictetus taught his students not to engage in needless talk. He said, "Let silence be your general rule, or say only what is necessary and in few words." That is not repression, it is mastery, the kind that turns speech into precision, not pollution. We live in a time where everyone talks, constantly, loudly, endlessly, but very few people say anything, and even fewer say it in a way that leaves a mark. Stoicism offers an alternative. Speak like a warrior draws a blade, not for show, not from emotion, but with purpose and restraint. Because every time you open your mouth, you're not just expressing yourself, you're revealing how much discipline you've cultivated. If your words are scattered, your mind is likely the same. If your speech is reckless, chances are your life is too. This is where the work begins, not with rehearsing clever lines or trying to sound wise, but with training the inner order from which your words flow. You begin by being present in conversation. You listen more than you speak. You observe your own reactions. You notice how often you interrupt, over-explain, justify, or try to dominate. And you start removing what's unnecessary until what remains is essential. There's a scene I often return to in memory. A young woman, nervous, intelligent, full of ideas, stood up in a room of seasoned professionals to present her vision for a community project. She stumbled through her first sentence, flushed, apologized, but then she paused, took a breath, and began again, slower, clearer. No more filler, no more sorry, just truth. And as she spoke, the room changed. Because when someone knows what they're saying and says it without performing, people listen, not out of politeness, but out of respect. This is what your voice can do when it's aligned with inner clarity. And this is the right way to use your words, not to impress, but to express virtue. You speak calmly because you're not ruled by emotion. You speak precisely because you've thought deeply. You speak only when needed because your silence is not emptiness, it's intention. So how do you train this? Not by studying rhetoric or memorizing tricks. You begin with observation. Each time you speak, reflect afterward. Was I grounded? Did I interrupt? Was I trying to win or trying to understand? Then, slowly, shift your habits. Eliminate unnecessary disclaimers. Speak in full sentences. Use pauses to give your words weight. And above all, do not rush. Rushing is the reflex of the unprepared. The disciplined mind moves slowly and surely because it knows where it stands. You will fail. You will blurt out. You will feel foolish. But each failure is a forge. And if you keep returning to the work, if you keep returning to stillness, to the page, to the mirror of reflection, you'll find that your speech changes. And when it does, so does your impact. Because people don't remember how loudly you spoke. They remember how clearly you spoke. They remember how you made them feel, not manipulated, but understood. Not dominated, but seen. your voice becomes a quiet force, like the tide, persistent, deliberate, inevitable. This is not about sounding like a stoic. It's about being one. Let your speech be the residue of your training. Let your clarity be your presence. Let your words rise from a place so still, so ordered that no one dares interrupt, not out of fear, but out of reverence. In a world addicted to noise, the man or woman who speaks with calm precision is unforgettable. And when your words begin to carry the scent of virtue, when they reveal discipline, honesty, restraint, and courage, you will not need to seek authority. You will become it. So the next time you enter a room, don't worry about how to sound powerful. Worry about how to stay rooted. Don't rush to speak. Wait. Feel the silence. Then, when the moment is right, speak slowly. Speak clearly. And speak only what you're willing to live by. Because in the end, your voice is not just your sound. It is your signal. And once it is disciplined, you won't need to raise it. And now that your voice has become the blade, honed by reason and silence, the next question must be asked. What kind of inner material are you cutting through? Let's look deeper. Let's turn to the page, not for others, but for your own clarity. Let's explore how writing reveals the battlefield and how your thinking shapes the life you live. 3. The pen reveals the self. Have you ever been afraid to sit alone with your thoughts? Not because something terrible might happen, but because you know that once the noise of the world fades, you'll finally have to face yourself, your unfinished plans, your contradictions, the quiet truth you've been avoiding. In the silence, everything comes forward. That's when many people reach for distractions. But a Stoic, he reaches for the pen. Marcus Aurelius didn't write Meditations as a public message. He wrote it in the dead of night, surrounded by wars, betrayal, and power. And what did he write about? Not victory, not fame, not control, but about discipline, acceptance, clarity, and humility. You have power over your mind, he reminded himself, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. That's what the pen gave him, a way to see his own mind without illusion. Because once your thoughts are written, they stop hiding. They stand naked in front of you, without excuse. Writing for a Stoic is not decoration. It is exposure. You don't write to sound wise. You write to see what you actually think, what you actually value, what you're still lying to yourself about. The page becomes a battlefield where you either bring order to your thinking or allow your chaos to remain unchallenged. And once you see your own confusion in ink, there's no turning away from it. That's the point. You don't write to feel better. You write to become better. I knew a man, years ago, who seemed unstoppable on the outside. Confident, respected, always 2 steps ahead. But underneath the surface, he was suffocating. He didn't know why he was working so hard. He didn't understand why he felt hollow when the applause came. One day, out of sheer restlessness, he opened a notebook and wrote one question. What do I truly want? What followed wasn't pretty. Pages of anger, confusion, regret. But in that mess, he found a direction he had ignored for years. Simplicity. A return to purpose. He sold his business, moved closer to his father, and began again, not with noise, but with clarity. And every day since, he writes 3 sentences, not for the world, for himself. That's what writing does. It confronts you. It shows you the gap between who you pretend to be and who you are. And if you're brave enough to look without turning away, the pen becomes a compass, a mirror that doesn't lie. You begin to see where your mind repeats patterns that have failed you, where you react instead of reflect, where you cling instead of release. Epictetus once said, Know first who you are, and then adorn yourself accordingly. But how can you know who you are if you've never written down your beliefs? If you've never challenged your own thinking, tested it, refined it? The pen forces you to slow down, to choose your words, to sort through the noise and ask, do I truly believe this? Is this mine, or was this handed to me? Writing is the warrior's practice. Not the external warrior, but the one who wages war on confusion, excuses, and undisciplined thought. It's where you stop being reactive and start becoming intentional. And it's not glamorous. Some days the words won't come. Some days they'll come too fast. But if you stay with it, if you return to the page again and again, you'll begin to notice something. Your life becomes more coherent. You make fewer decisions you regret. You spot your triggers before they take hold. You recover faster when storms hit. Not because life gets easier, but because your inner world is no longer a mystery to you. The act of writing doesn't require hours. Start with 5 minutes. One question, one reflection. Ask yourself, what am I running from today? What virtue did I forget to practice? What matters more than I've been treating it? That's it. No need to show anyone. No need to be perfect. You're not creating a performance. You're building a structure for your mind to stand on. A scaffolding that can hold the weight of real challenges, not just convenient ones. There's a reason the Stoics wrote, it wasn't for fame, it was survival. To be tossed between fortune and hardship and still remain centered, you need something deeper than willpower. You need reason. And reason doesn't appear out of thin air. It is forged in silence, through examination, through pages that know your secrets better than your friends ever could. And when you've written enough, something shifts. Your decisions become cleaner. You no longer chase every emotional gust. You stop seeking validation from the crowd because you've already debated yourself in the dark and emerged with clarity. The pen becomes your counsel, your anchor, and your mind becomes less of a battlefield and more of a kingdom. Writing is not a cure. It won't erase pain or remove uncertainty. But it will remind you that you are capable of facing truth, that you don't need to fear your own thoughts, that there's a part of you deeper than the chaos, a stillness you can return to every time you pick up the pen. That is the root of strength, not bravado, not showmanship, but the courage to confront yourself honestly and return to the world with integrity. So if you've been feeling scattered, unsure, overwhelmed, don't rush outward. Sit, breathe, pick up the pen, begin where you are, write without judgment, ask without fear, reflect without distraction, because in that moment, you're not just journaling, you're taking full responsibility for your inner life. And that is the right way to live, not perfectly, but honestly. If this message resonated with you, write the word mirror in the comments. It's a simple gesture to show you're walking the path inward. And if you find value in this journey, consider subscribing. Not out of obligation, but to stay grounded in a world that pulls you in every direction. Now that we've seen how writing reveals the mind, there's another discipline even more rare, the ability to remain still when provoked, to let silence speak for you. Let's explore how the art of restraint turns noise into power. 4. Silence is strength. Have you ever been in a conversation where every part of you wanted to interrupt, wanted to correct the lie, defend your name or prove your worth, yet something deeper inside whispered, "Wait, say nothing," and somehow, by staying silent, you walked away with more dignity than if you had said a word? That silence didn't feel weak. It felt clean, strong, like something ancient had held your tongue while your presence did the speaking. That moment is rare. But when it happens, you start to understand something the world often forgets. Silence is not the absence of strength. It's one of its purest expressions. The Stoics taught us that not everything deserves a response. Not every insult is worth a reply. Not every challenge is worth answering. Epictetus said, "If someone speaks ill of you, live in such a way that no one will believe it." It's not because you're above the situation. It's because you know how to guard your peace. When someone slanders you, argues with you, provokes you, they are offering you a contract that says, "You and I are now at war." But a wise person knows they don't have to sign it. In fact, they know that the refusal to engage is often the sharpest move. Imagine this. A young advisor in the Roman Senate, eager to prove himself, is constantly baited by a more senior rival, one who mocks him in public, questions his competence, and tries to embarrass him at every turn. The young man burns inside, rehearses responses in his mind, and dreams of the perfect verbal comeback. But instead of speaking, he does his job. He listens carefully, works diligently, speaks only when asked, and lets the quality of his actions do the talking. Over time, the room begins to shift. His restraint becomes respected. His rival's loudness begins to look insecure. And one day, when the rival tries another insult, the young man simply turns, meets his eyes, and says nothing. The room falls silent. Everyone feels the weight of that quiet, because in that moment, his silence wasn't empty, it was full of strength. This is what silence does when it's born of self-mastery. It turns the expected into the unexpected. It creates space for reflection, not escalation. It unsettles those who seek control through chaos, because they don't know how to respond to someone who doesn't bite. They're prepared for your defense. They're ready for your outrage. But they're never ready for your calm. And let's be clear, this is not about suppressing your voice. It's about refining it. There's a silence that comes from fear, and there's a silence that comes from power. One hides, the other stands tall without needing to shout. One avoids, the other absorbs. That's the kind of silence the Stoics practiced, not passivity, but presence. A silence that listens with discipline, that speaks only when words are necessary, and that holds its ground without needing to perform. Marcus Aurelius, surrounded by war, betrayal, and pressure no modern leader could imagine, didn't write of anger or revenge. He wrote of clarity. He wrote, "The best revenge is to be unlike him who performed the injury." In other words, you don't defeat insult with insult. You defeat it by refusing to become what you despise. You don't match their chaos. You root deeper into your order. And that order often speaks best through silence. But let's be honest, it's hard. When someone questions your worth, it's natural to want to explain. When someone lies about you, it's tempting to correct them publicly. And sometimes, yes, truth must be spoken. But the warrior doesn't fight every battle. He chooses. He waits. He watches. Because he knows that reacting to everything is the fastest way to give away your power. The moment you're provoked and pulled off center, you're no longer living by your philosophy. You're living by someone else's bait. There's a story of an old master and his student. The student asked, "How do I know when to speak and when to remain silent?" The master pointed to a sword hanging on the wall. "This blade is kept sharp but hidden. It's not drawn for every threat. It's not used to prove its edge. But when the moment is right, when virtue calls, it strikes with clarity and ends the matter." The student nodded slowly. "So silence is not weakness?" The master smiled. "Silence is what makes your words sharp when you do speak. Speak too often, and your voice dulls. Speak with discipline, and your words become law. That's the right way, not to remain silent forever, but to speak with purpose. To let your quiet presence do more than 1,000 arguments ever could. To train your tongue as much as your body. To know when a glance is stronger than a speech. And to realize that silence, when backed by truth, is never empty. It's thunder held in reserve. We live in a world that values reaction. Everyone wants the last word, the clever comeback, the viral moment. But the Stoic doesn't chase applause. He chases alignment. He asks himself, will these words serve virtue or just my pride? And if the answer is pride, he lets the silence stand. Because sometimes what they said doesn't need correction. It needs to echo into stillness until it fades. So when you find yourself about to fire back, pause. Ask, is this the moment I draw the sword? Or is this the moment I keep it sheathed? Knowing that I'm not here to prove anything, I'm here to live aligned with my principles. True strength isn't loud, it's measured. True presence isn't demanding, it's undeniable. And true mastery of the voice begins with the discipline of silence. That's how the Stoic outsmarts the noise, not by outshouting it, but by transcending it entirely. 5. Precision over noise. Have you ever watched someone dominate a room with silence? Not the kind of silence that comes from awkwardness or fear, but a quiet presence so sharp, so composed, that it cuts through every word floating in the air. They don't interrupt. They don't try to impress. But somehow, when they speak just a few deliberate words, the entire room listens. And when they don't, their silence says even more. That is not luck. That is not charisma. That is what happens when someone learns to exchange reaction for restraint and noise for precision. In a world addicted to opinions, noise is mistaken for strength. But the Stoics never chased volume. They cultivated weight. If you wish to be powerful, Epictetus wrote, control your desires. Do not strive to influence others. Instead, govern yourself. Influence to the Stoic is not a game of persuasion, it is a byproduct of self-mastery. It's the quiet gravity that forms around a person who no longer needs to prove anything. The world encourages you to speak up, to broadcast your every move, to declare your stance before you've even finished thinking. But the Stoic path is different. It asks you to slow down, to reflect before you speak, to question before you decide, and to know that sometimes the most effective response is no response at all. There was a strategist in the court of a Roman general, brilliant, logical, known for his planning. But he spoke too often, too quickly, trying to advise in every meeting, trying to be heard at every turn. His mind was sharp, but his words blurred his value. One day, the general pulled him aside and said, "You are wise, but you scatter your arrows. Speak only when it counts, and you will be feared more than 20 loud men." From that day forward, the strategist said little. But when he did, his words changed outcomes. Not because he became someone else, but because he refined his presence through silence. Precision in speech isn't just about what you say, it's about when you say it, why you say it, and what you're silent about. When you choose to say less, your words gather weight. People begin to notice your pauses. They lean in, not because you're shouting, but because your restraint is rare. Most people rush to fill the air. The disciplined individual knows that silence is not a void, it's a blade. It reveals who's speaking with thought and who's speaking to be seen. Marcus Aurelius often wrote about the brevity of life, the futility of noise, and the discipline of right action. But what many overlook is how much he valued speech as a moral responsibility. He believed your words should be like your actions, calm, measured, free from waste. Let no act be done without a purpose, he wrote, nor otherwise than according to the perfect principles of art. The same applies to speech. Don't speak unless it serves a principle. Don't speak unless it reveals clarity. But this isn't easy. When emotions rise, when ego is touched, when injustice breathes hot down your neck, it is tempting to unload, to argue, to drown your clarity in the illusion of control. That is when the real battle begins. And in that moment, the Stoic does not reach for more words. He reaches inward, he breathes, he grounds himself. And when he speaks, it is with the calm sharpness of someone who has already faced his fire in solitude. You become truly dangerous, not when you speak often, but when your speech reveals discipline. Not when you dominate the room, but when your absence shifts the energy. That is not manipulation. It is power built from restraint. A quiet sword forged by inner fire. I once watched a man in a courtroom remain completely still while a stream of lies was poured over his name. He didn't flinch. He didn't retaliate. He waited. And when it was his turn to speak, he asked just one question. It was simple, specific, but it dismantled everything that had been said before. Not because it was clever, but because it was grounded in truth, delivered without ego. That moment taught me something I never forgot. Sometimes, one question born from stillness has more impact than 1,000 arguments. If you want to lead, don't start with volume. Start with vision. If you want to be respected, don't chase attention. Cultivate integrity. If you want to cut through confusion, don't shout louder. Learn to wait, listen, and then speak with clean intent. That is the path of the Stoic. That is the discipline of the warrior, the one who trains not to defeat others, but to never be defeated by himself. This is not about becoming cold, it's about becoming clear. The more clear you are, the less noise you need. The more principle you live by, the fewer justifications you require. And when you no longer need to convince people of who you are, your presence begins to speak louder than your voice ever could. So if you feel unseen, overlooked, underestimated, don't race to speak louder. Don't compromise your stillness to be noticed by those who don't understand silence. Let your actions speak. Let your clarity shape your tone. Let your discipline do the heavy lifting, because in the long run, the person who knows when to speak and when not to wins without anyone realizing how. In the end, there are many ways to speak, but only one that leads to peace. That is the right way, the way of the calm, the focused, the precise. The one who does not waste words, who does not shout over chaos, but who waits, watches, and speaks only when it matters most. That is the voice that outlasts the noise. That is the tone that echoes long after the crowd has moved on. And that is the quiet power of the Stoic. Some people keep others confused so they can stay unchallenged. But you're choosing a different path. You're sharpening your thinking, your speech, your silence. That quiet strength will set you apart more than any spotlight ever could. If this message spoke to you, subscribe to keep sharpening your edge. And comment, silent power. Stay steady, stay clear. And remember, this journey is only beginning. In the next video, we'll go even deeper into the quiet habits that build unshakable presence.